All right. Mitch, if you want to open us up.
How you doing? So you might see my son here. So hi, my name is Mitchell Brown. I'm senior counsel at SCSJ, and also the director of the Solve Network. Welcome to Prison Gerrymandering, how one count leads to a decade of distortion. Thank you so much for joining us today. Micah says hi as well. Thank you for joining. Can you go to the next slide? So here are the example. Here are the example of how to do interpretation. In the next slide as well. So if you need Spanish language assistance, we have 2 interpreters here as well that are.
And I believe you had your hand up, Karen.
All right. Do our interpreters need to give any instructions? Yes. So I'll pass it over to Susan.
Yes.
To Karen.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. We are interpreting English to Spanish. Estamos interpretando inglés a español. Mi nombre es Karen y mi cointérprete es Susan. Venimos de Tilde. En su pantalla ven el slide sobre cómo tener acceso a la interpretación. Si están conectándose vía computadora, por favor, busquen el icono, la figurita del mundito que dice interpretación, seleccione el idioma español y podrá tener acceso a la interpretación. Si se está conectando por teléfono, por favor, busque y encuentre los 3 puntitos, seleccione el idioma de interpretación y seleccione español. Okay, eso es todo. That's all. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Karen.
All right, so thank you for bearing with us with the interpretation. We will have both the English and Spanish recordings available on YouTube after, and we'll send that out with a follow-up email. So you just heard from Mitchell Brown, who is our new Solve Networks director. He has been the senior counsel for voting rights at SCSJ. And I'm gonna let him stay off camera for now since he's got Micah. And Anaya cannot be here with us, but she is our Solve Policy and Communications Fellow. And we'll talk more in a minute about a project that she's up to. And I am Jenny McKinney. I am the Communications Fellow for Solve, and Prison Gerrymandering has been my life for the past several months of just trying to compile information and take a topic that a lot of folks don't know about and try to illustrate the impact on all of us. So I hope that you enjoy tonight's presentation and find it useful. I'm going to jump right in. So the newsletter that we send out each month, you should get it in your inbox on the 18th, or if that is on a weekend, you'll get it the following business day. And we have resources that we send out to folks that we think would be helpful to your work. We spotlight network members who you may want to connect with, or whose work you may pull inspiration from. And then we share regional wins, because we know that this work can be tiring and seems like we have setbacks quite often. So we do want to celebrate our wins. We share events and trainings, funding opportunities when we hear about them. And then Anaya is starting a policy newsletter, which will come out at the end of the month. starting this month. And so that will have some policy updates and analysis for you. And this QR code, you can scan it with the camera on your phone, and it will take you to our sign up form. So tonight we'll talk about prison gerrymandering, of course, but we need to start with the foundation of equal representation, or as you may hear it, one person, one vote. We'll talk about how the census counts people and how that impacts our voting districts. And we'll talk about what prison gerrymandering looks like in Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And then we will go into a case study about some local advocacy that FCSJ and partners did, and talk about what it's going to take to end prison gerrymandering. So the principle of equal representation, of course, is that each person's vote should count as much as the next person's. So if our district is a pie, we get the same size piece as our neighbors. And so to achieve this, each voting district must have the same total population within one person. So that looks like, 10 people in one district and 10 people in the next. If we had unequal districts, then you would have something that looks like what's on the screen. So each person in that district on the left makes up 10% of their district, but District B only has 5 people. And so each resident there has about twice the amount of political power as a resident in District A, assuming that they are both districts in the same county, so they share a county board of commissioners. Voter in District B would have more pull with their representative because they hold more political power and voting strength. And so when officials go to draw new voting maps, they use census blocks from census data, which is only taken every 10 years. It's the official count of the population. You may have received a form in the mail, as well as many, many reminders to fill it out. And so this is the closest that we can get to knowing exactly how many people are in a voting district. The census counts people at their usual residence, which they consider to be where you live or sleep most of the time. And for many people, that is not quite clear. So we think about truck drivers, Congress members, military service members, boarding school students, as well as folks who are incarcerated or being held in detention centers. Those folks are not necessarily at home, but they're still part of their communities, on census day regardless. And so the census does take into account family and community ties and acknowledges their importance for the folks on the left of this table, right? The truck drivers, Congress members, military service members, and boarding school students. By contrast, they do not extend that consideration to folks who are incarcerated. They do this even though most state constitutions and laws say that incarceration does not change a person's place of residence. And so when we talk about prison gerrymandering, what we're talking about is the distortion to representation that occurs when voting maps are drawn using those census numbers that count people who are incarcerated as residents of that facility as opposed to in their home communities. So that makes it look like the district has more people than it really does. And the key here is the distortion. It is not the intent. A lot of districts prison gerrymander, a lot of officials prison gerrymander without knowing that this distortion is happening. So when we talk about prison gerrymandering, it really is the practice of using that raw census data and using that to draw the voting maps. I'm going to try to play this video. Mitch, will you let me know if the sound is coming through?
There's a big problem with the census data that officials use to draw our voting maps. The Bureau counts incarcerated people in their prison cell instead of in their homes, where they will likely return and where most states consider them to be residents. This misrepresentation lasts for a decade until the next count, even though these individuals often have much shorter sentences. When officials redistrict using this data, they count incarcerated populations in the district where they are temporarily displaced and not at home. As a result, districts with correctional facilities have fewer genuine residents, and those voters wind up with more voting power than voters in other districts without these facilities. This is prison gerrymandering, and it distorts our voting districts.
So that video is in a nutshell what prison gerrymandering is. It is important to note that prison gerrymandering impact and its negative impact is not just to political power across districts near prisons or jails or detention facilities. It is also the distortion to the representation of those folks who are incarcerated. It doesn't represent them in their home communities. It makes their home communities look different demographically than it is in reality, and that has consequences whenever we're looking at what issues are top priority for the elected officials there.
There's a big problem.
And so we're going back to that illustration. Now we've got two districts that technically have the same number of residents, but as you can see in District A, 3 of the residents are actually incarcerated. So they're not true residents. And what I mean by that isn't that they're not stakeholders in the district where they're incarcerated, but it does mean that through felony disenfranchisement in many of our member states, and most of the states in the US, they are not constituents. They don't have a constituent relationship with those representatives. And if we consider displacement, then that's another aspect where if somebody is incarcerated more than 50 miles away from their home community, then they may not have any idea about that county or even that state if we're talking about federal facilities. And so when we say not true residents, we aren't discounting that they are impacted by decisions there, but that they have more of a stake at home and would be better represented at home.
Jenny, before I interrupt this, can we go a little slower?
Mm-hmm. And so the impact looks different depending on who you're talking about, but it impacts way more people than just folks who are incarcerated. They and their communities are misrepresented, and that misrepresentation lasts for until the next census, which is 10 years. And people who live near correctional facilities will have enhanced representation because they make up a bigger piece of their pie, since people who are incarcerated are not getting a piece. That pie, that leftover pie, is distributed to the rest of the residents, and they have enhanced power. So those facilities we know are typically located in more white and rural areas. So those are the communities that tend to benefit. And then residents of districts that don't include a correctional facility are going to be underrepresented compared to residents of those that do. Now, when we're talking about enhanced representation, that can be a benefit to those communities. There's also a risk of dysfunction in communities that have fewer residents, because especially in local government races that are determined by only a few votes, officials can more easily obtain and entrench themselves in political power. So I'm going to stop here and ask if anyone has questions about prison gerrymandering itself before we jump into what it looks like in some of our member states and how we can combat it. So feel free to pop questions into the chat or the Q&A.
Mary, we see your hand. Mary, did you have a question, Mary? Okay. Other questions?
All right, y'all feel free to pop them in the chat as we go through these maps. I'm hoping to hear from folks who are on the ground in these states. I can look at a map and data all day, but I'm not on the ground. I don't know the full context. So please feel free to drop any insight that you have into the chat. Oh, we've got.
Oh, yeah, Jenny, we got a question. Katie Kendrick.
You should be able to unmute.
Yes. Okay, I can unmute. I'm sorry, I wasn't unmuted, but it does say that the chat is disabled. And there's a lot more I need to know about prison gerrymandering. I understand that some states, some locations, they count the prisoners just like they do the students wherever they're living, when it should be maybe otherwise. I guess I'll leave it at that. I do have another question, but I'll leave it at that and listen. I'll listen.
Okay, so since the census data is sort of the gold standard for what data is available to redistricting officials, most states we'll look at the end and see a map of what areas have taken action to stop prison gerrymandering, to change that data so that people are counted at home. But that is extremely like labor intensive and resource intensive. And so what we'll talk about in a little while is the solution has to come from the national level and changing how the census counts people. And so we'll talk more about what those next steps are on the national level in just a moment. I see Ramona. Hi, Ramona. Said when Peter Wagner began his research on prison-based gerrymandering, it was at the height of mass incarceration stemming from the crack epidemic. To gain a full understanding of the detrimental impact of prison gerrymandering, a historical context is recommended. Thank you, Ramona.
And then, Jenny, before we go, Mary, I know the chat's not working. Do you want to ask your question and come off mute? Okay, you can go ahead, Jen.
On the with the webinar function, it allows us to have more attendees. The Q&A is the public forum, and so I apologize for the chat not being open. So what it looks like in North Carolina for the impact of prison gerrymandering on this statewide level, and you'll need to keep in mind the impact on the local level is greater because those districts have smaller amounts of people. And so it makes a big difference when you include an entire facility's population there. But on the statewide level, we can see how it impacts our national representation. And so we've got, these are North Carolina's latest congressional districts, which of course are about to be redrawn. And so we can see that District 1, if we were to reallocate folks in just state detention facilities, then they would lose a big part of their district's population. Whereas District 6, District 12, these districts would gain a lot of people back. So District 1 is sort of artificially inflated, and those folks have more political power than folks in the neighboring districts. And on the right, you can see the demographic changes with Black and white populations, and how District 11, especially, the demographics change. And so sometimes, not sometimes, oftentimes, whenever folks are counted away from home, that changes the demographics, not just of their home community, but it makes the community where they are incarcerated look more ethnically and racially diverse than it really is, because Black, Latine, and in general, urban communities or metropolitan communities have been more negatively impacted by mass incarceration at greater rates. And so that demographic kind of manipulation of the representation is also important. Then moving to South Carolina, we can see similarly there's a big concentration in District 6 where a big part of the population are folks that are incarcerated, and they are not being represented in their home communities. And again, this data is just based on reallocating people in state facilities, which state facilities do make up around half of folks who are incarcerated per state. About half of those folks are in state facilities, but there is, of course, a significant population in jails or in federal prisons as well. And this data is taken by reallocating people to the county, usually using data of where they were convicted. And so in Edgefield County, we've got FCI Edgefield, which is a federal facility in District 4. And then we've also got Trenton Correctional Institution. And so you can see that District 3's population would be 9.6% larger if they prison gerrymandered. Edgefield County has ended prison gerrymandering, and so this is hypothetical, but District 4 would significantly benefit from prison gerrymandering. And now Louisiana, we've got District 5, you can see, is very stark in how much they benefit from prison gerrymandering. And that, of course, is the district where Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola is located. And Shreveport, I believe, is in the 4th district. New Orleans, I believe, is in District 2, and then Baton Rouge is in District 6. And these red circles represent state correctional facilities. So that big one is the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. And the districts in Louisiana each have 776,292 people. And so I guess when you think about this, it's could be easy to fall into, well, this is, you know, kind of a drop in the bucket, or somebody could make that claim. But in reality, you know, the rule is one person, one vote, not approximately one vote. And so this is important on the state level as well as on those local levels where the distortion is greater. In,
Question.
yes,
What you showed about Louisiana and now Mississippi, are those U.S. congressional districts you're pointing out there?
yes, these are the latest congressional districts.
U.S. congressional districts. Okay, that's what I thought. And on a side note, that's another reason Angola has lasted so long is that they do labor on a farm there. So some of that revenue benefits only certain people in that immediate community, tends to. Yeah.
Right, right. And, you know, these districts where facilities are located benefit from these facilities, not just in political power, but they also benefit, as you said, from labor. And sometimes that is from the folks who are incarcerated, and it's also jobs for folks who live there. And so it's important to think about who representatives in those areas are accountable to, and who is counted in their district. So in Mississippi, if you were to take away the prison population from District 3, then District 1 becomes more populous. So we're assuming that based on those numbers, a lot of the folks who are making up District 3, at least on paper using that census data, they're coming from District 1. And so their political power is literally moving across that district line. And these district lines are drawn around blocks, which are the smallest kind of unit that you can break communities down into. Sometimes it's a block, sometimes it's an apartment building. And so it is really precise where these lines are drawn. And so having 1,515 people, that changes significantly where the lines get drawn and what communities are included in a district, what communities are kept together or cracked apart. And so, you know, looking at these maps, we can see the stark colors and the changes in representation, but we can't forget what it looks like on the ground of, you know, I live 5 minutes from my aunt, but she's in a completely different congressional district than I am. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to end prison gerrymandering, and one of the ways is on the local level. So we're going to talk about some local advocacy in Granville County that SCSJ did in 2021. And that was during a redistricting process. And we had seen that in 2010, incarcerated individuals made up 40% of the County Board of Commissioners' 3rd district. So one district, 40% of the residents were actually incarcerated individuals. And then we saw the 2020 census data came out. They had to redistrict to take account any changes. And so there were about 60,000 total residents, split among 7 districts for the county commissioner board. That meant about 8,500 people per district. Excuse me, but at Butner Federal Facility in Granville County, 2,023 incarcerated individuals were included in or would have been included in that district's population, changing the size, the geographic size of the district, as well as what communities were included in it. But we sought to influence the County Board of Commissioners to end prison gerrymandering. And one of the most accessible ways to do that was to write to them on behalf of ourselves and partners. And in doing so, we got some pushback in the local press. And the editor of the Daily Dispatch wrote about how voting rights outweighed prison gerrymandering concerns. And I think that that headline is a little bit of an oxymoron because we consider prison gerrymandering to be part of the larger conversation around felony disenfranchisement and voting rights. And those claims in their paper were focused on, they were worried about how it would impact military and students representation. It's important to note that the solution we're advocating for is to change how they count incarcerated individuals, to use the same criteria of not just where they live and sleep, but also their ties to their community. And so changing it to do that would not impact students or military members negatively. We're not changing how they would be counted. So that was a misconception. One of the other reasons or misconceptions they seem to have was they cited service demands, increased service demands for the district with the facility. And it's important to note that this census data does not, this prison gerrymander data does not impact funding. There are other data sources that are used for funding, and sometimes the census, but not in the sense of people at facilities being misrepresented in those funding situations. So we got that pushback in the press based on misconceptions, and we took the opportunity to do some follow-up advocacy and clear up some of those misconceptions and do some education about what it was, because clearly there were some misunderstandings, and we made some progress in the press. Tim Karen was one of the County Board of Commissioners we originally reached out to, and he came on the record, and he is a Republican, and he came on the record and said you should in prison gerrymandering. He didn't want to benefit from it. And so that was great progress. And in November of 2021, when Granville County drew their new voting maps, they ended prison gerrymandering by excluding the relevant prison populations. And that took a lot of admin work on their part to go in and change that data. So, and still we ended up with a solution that was excluding people, not counting them in their communities, just excluding people. And so the takeaways from Granville County was that prison gerrymandering can cause huge distortions in local representation. We saw some distortions on the state level, but those distortions are much greater on local representation. And the communities and elected officials, even those who might benefit, don't want prison gerrymandering once they know what it is, for the most part. Now, that may not be a priority to end it, but there aren't really folks who embrace the idea that they want people who are not true residents and who are only incarcerated in their community to be part of their electorate. And then the other takeaways were that advocating for a change at the local level it requires a lot of resources and a lot of time and energy that really could be best rectified by the census just changing how they count people. The data is available, it is possible, and in the public comments for the 2020 census, folks who commented on prison gerrymandering overwhelmingly wanted to end it and count people at home. So we're seeing this national movement to end prison gerrymandering, but we see that the barrier currently is how the census counts folks. And in April, there was legislation introduced to end prison gerrymandering nationwide. That legislation would change how the Census Bureau counts folks. And as part of this campaign, as we're shifting to national advocacy, it's going to be vital that we educate our communities on issues like this impacting them that they may not know about. People may not think about where folks are counted in the census, or how people decide where to draw voting districts. And so educating our communities is going to be important to put pressure on their representatives to take action. So we have created some resources for use in your advocacy. There's an educational toolkit already created, and that's the one pictured here. And it has case studies that are North Carolina specific, but everything in there other than case studies is accurate across the board. And we are getting a regional toolkit together for the Solve network, which will have the maps that we saw tonight and some updated information about the 2030 census's public comments. We also have the one pager, and that is really meant to be a resource for folks who are, old school, just a normal printer. That'll be easy to print front and back. We have talking points for advocates. We've got sample social media graphics and posts. You can get this presentation. We'll even give you an editable version of it if you contact us. And so those resources, we hope that they're helpful in your work. And even if it's not y'all printing our resources, but just creating your own and having some of the legwork done for you, then we're happy to be helpful in any way. This is another resource that may be helpful. It is the Correctional Facility Locator from Prison Policy Initiative. They do a ton of work nationally on prison gerrymandering and mass incarceration in general. And so this tool will help you find out how many folks in your district or in your state are in a correctional facility and not, residents that chose to be in that district and have ties there. And then just today there was an op-ed, and it was a bipartisan op-ed that wrote about how prisons shouldn't be called homes, especially in the census. And it was a really great op-ed that you should check out. They're trying to build bipartisan support, as I said, for this national legislation. And then the Prison Policy Initiative released a new extensive blog post sort of analyzing the 2030 census public comments that were about prison gerrymandering. And you've got folks who were incarcerated or their families who put it into their own words what the impact of this is. So those are helpful resources. And then if you would like support on this or really anything else in your work, then you can contact us. That solve@scssj.org is a general inbox. So that is the best way to make sure that you reach somebody regardless of staff changes. Mitchell is the Solve Network Director, and so you can reach out to him. Anaya and I are the fellows, as I said, and so our fellowships are time limited. So if you reach out to us, I would just also CC Mitchell or the Solve email as well. And the last thing is just to thank our partners. So Prison Policy Initiative has been wonderful. The Redistricting Data Hub is a national organization, and they have some great data on prison gerrymandering. And like I said, it is national. NC Counts has helped us to create Spanish resources. And we're still in the works with that, making sure we have appropriate language. And that will be coming down the pipe too soon. So Mitchell, did we have anything else pop up in the chat?
No, nothing in the chat. Nothing in the chat, but just wanted to open it up for other questions that people may have. I know some people asked about the PowerPoint. We're going to go back and talk as a team to send, figure out how to send the non-editable version of the PowerPoint. So just hold tight to them. But I just want to open up for questions.
Well, I just have a request. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Our request is, since the chat is disabled, I see the links there. When you send the final email, can you include those links in that?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that.
But my second question is, when you have this approach to talking to local people about why it's a bad idea, what are some of the most common objections or pushback you tend to get?
Yeah, I can. Jenny, you want to answer that, or I can answer that?
You can answer, and if I have anything to add, I will.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, I'm on two computers, y'all. So one of the biggest pieces of pushback is people just don't know about it. One, they don't know how it affects their district. You know, we provided the example of Granville County, North Carolina. So that's one big piece of pushback is, you know, people didn't know. They don't know that. And second, you know, and sadly, this is the case. And I haven't experienced this in my work around prison gerrymandering, but one of the things is that we've seen is that people just don't care about people that have felony records. They don't care about incarcerated individuals. And so it's not an issue to them, especially when you have partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering kind of taking the cake on redistricting issues. So those are the two big things that I've seen.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the not people just not knowing what it is. It's a pretty like niche topic. Some folks don't even know what gerrymandering is, and then you bring in this topic of prison gerrymandering. It seems very very niche and very specific. And so that's one aspect of it. I think tying this into the conversation about felony disenfranchisement is important for that reason, because it can get folks that are already involved in conversations about the harms of mass incarceration, talking about this as well specifically. And as well as Mitch said, the bias against folks who have been impacted by incarceration and who have been justice involved, to explain the harm of this in ways that you know, emphasize the impact on people who are directly affected, but also speak to how this hurts everybody. And that's also true of felony disenfranchisement when we think about an inclusive democracy and successful reentry. The other kind of misconceptions or pushbacks, I think, are as we saw with the Daily Dispatch, possibly concerns about funding, that maybe funding, people think, you know, funding should follow incarcerated individuals because the correctional facility has expenses. Well, this doesn't impact funding. And so just clearing up that misconception can be somewhat helpful. And then the admin burden is the other big pushback, at least from officials. And so, you know, anything that you can do to advocate for the national change that will lighten that administrative burden on the local level is great. If you can reach out to, you know, our research department or other folks doing the work, then we may be able to help those officials navigate the data and know what resources they can use to at least lighten that that administrative work. And I see your hand is up. Let me see if I can And you should be able to unmute now. And then
Okay,
Betty, I've got you next.
okay, so just to sort of make it simple in my mind. For example, in our locale, we have a prison that is in a pretty affluent area. Well, it became a more affluent area. And so if you're trying to make the people equal in each district, and you remove the ones who are in prison and they go to wherever they live, say if they can vote, then they would vote in their area. And then how do you satisfy the equalization of people in each area? So with that, that would change the lines. Is that correct? When, you know, when you're talking to people.
So I think what I hear you asking is the how do you make sure that the districts are equal once you've reallocated people, and once people, you know, how do you make sure where people are voting is still upholding the one vote, one person, one vote? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so when we draw the voting maps, we know that not everybody that we counted in that district from the census that happened 3 years ago, people have moved since then. So it's not completely accurate. It's not foolproof. It is our best guesstimate. And what we're saying is that guesstimate can be better. And it needs to be better, because this is, you know, of course you're going to have some inaccuracies, but don't we want it to be as accurate as it possibly can be? And so it is especially inaccurate when we talk about folks who are incarcerated being somewhere different within 10 years. Most people who are incarcerated on census day have a much shorter sentence than 10 years left. And so that's that piece about this data is not perfect for actually having equal vote. It's a principle that we strive to uphold. And then in terms of who votes where, it depends on the state in terms of if folks convicted of felonies are disenfranchised for life, which got struck down in Mississippi. But we will see what the result is on that and the larger impact. And then there are states where folks are disenfranchised while they're serving their sentence or while they're fulfilling any financial pieces. And that is the case in North Carolina. And then you've got folks in jails who, a lot of folks are waiting to find out if they are going to have a conviction. A lot of folks are there for misdemeanor cases. And so they do have their right to vote. And I went up to Buncombe County with You Can Vote to register folks in the jail, and they could register. We were requesting absentee ballots, and they could either vote, get the ballot from their home address and have it sent to the facility, or they could update their registration to the jail if they didn't have another address where they could receive mail. And so that is somewhat separate. Who actually ends up voting in a district is somewhat separate from the count. The count gives us an idea of how many people are, going to be represented by the same official. And who actually votes in that district is will change with every election because of people moving.
Right, and so, but essentially, what happens is the total map is redrawn by whatever number you have of people who actually live, say, in my county. So, say if you've got 300 people incarcerated, those 300 people would go over to another district, so you would have to balance out the lines, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And that's what I was saying with the census blocks. So that would change which census blocks, which literal street blocks, which apartment buildings, what communities are represented by the same person. And
Okay,
so that,
got it. Yeah,
yeah.
okay, I got it. Okay.
Betty, I'm gonna unmute you. You're gonna have to hit it on your side too.
Okay. My question is, listening to you, I have two. Well, one of them is a statement because I am from Mississippi and we are so undercounted here. And we know the reason why we are undercounted. But my real question becomes, because it makes me wondering of listening to you tonight, Jenny, if the ones that are truly incarcerated, are they actually being counted? Because, you know, looking at when it even so to the point when it comes to voting, if you have committed certain crimes, then we know that you cannot vote. So it makes me wonder, how is it that we can actually know, and I know that they are not going to tell us, but my thing of it is to make sure that they are truly counted, though. And that their vote actually count. And I say that because of, as I stated earlier, if there's certain a crime that you have committed, you can't vote. So do they go in the ones that are there at the jail, at the prison, do they actually know the ones that have committed one of those felonies and they can't vote? Or do they let everyone vote?
So when they do the census, the facility does it all at once. And I'm not 100% sure of the process. Mitch, feel free to intervene. Do you know the process of filling out the census?
Yeah. So Betty, what I heard in your question is, I think I need to clarify, is that you're referring to people being able to vote and making sure their votes count. When it comes to the census, it's just looking at the total population. So they know the total population of those prisons, and that is the count. That's the population of that area. You know, whether or not they're able to vote or not is a secondary question, but it's a valid question. But the first step is counting the total population, and then whether or not. And so, to your second part of your question, do they know who has certain felonies that disenfranchise them? Yes, because they know why they're there at the prison. But whether or not they actually help these people register to vote or make sure that they have access to the ballot, that I question that as well. But I think I just want to make sure that was clear, that for purposes of prison gerrymandering, they know the total count for those jails and prisons, and that is for the census, they know the total count. But whether or not they actually are whether or not the votes count, that's a secondary question that we also need to work on as well. But they're two separate issues.
Yeah, thank you.
Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute and ask a question, or if you're on the ground in one of these states and have an observation. Zephyr said, I second this. My first few passes at looking at prison gerrymandering in Alabama. If I'm reading prison gerrymandering's projects data correctly, Alabama undercounted the prison population in multiple locations. What's interesting for us is that Alabama is currently being sued by the Department of Justice over our jails, and they self-reported numbers to get legislators to give them $1 billion for new jails. The numbers don't seem to match up. Is this something we've seen in other places?
I don't think that's something that we've looked into, Zephyr. But I do think that this goes to Betty's question, that, there are issues with the total population count, issues with those who are able to vote in the prisons, whether or not their votes are actually counted, whether they have access to the ballot. But I can't personally speak to whether or not we've seen it in other states. So, I'll open up to the group, if there are other states that have seen this similar thing. But that's a good question, Zephyr. So that's something that we should add to our list to look at, because that is a very good point.
All right. I don't want to keep our interpreters too late past time. We so appreciate y'all being here. And Mitch, I'm not sure if we had anybody join that utilized the Spanish interpretation in real time, but I know that the recording will be appreciated from many of our partners.
Yeah, so. I've been recording it on my other computer, and so once I get that, I will we'll send that out to folks.
Thank you so much, Karen and Susan. And if anybody has any lingering questions, you can contact us at solve@scSJ.org. If you want to know kind of more specific answers or more technical answers that may need research, we're happy to answer those, but we want to do it accurately. And so make sure you email us with it and we'll get an answer back to you. Thank you so much for taking the time on your Tuesday night.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. All right.